My name is Steve Westgarth, and this is The Engineering Leader. Today on The Engineering Leader, I'm joined by Rob Whitaker. Rob is an iOS engineer working at Curva, previously having worked at Capital One. He specialises in mobile accessibility and is the author of the book Developing Inclusive Mobile Apps. Rob, thank you so much for joining The Engineering Leader today.
Hi Steve, great to speak to you.
And before we begin, could I just confirm that you also write bad code?
Have you been speaking to my colleagues? Have you? Yes, of course I write bad code.
I've spoken to all of your colleagues and they think your code is awful, but it's good you recognise that.
That doesn't surprise me.
So let's cut straight to the chase. Why don't you kick off by telling us a bit about yourself and a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess by day I'm an iOS engineer. I work, as you mentioned, for a place called Curva currently. They are a car insurance fintech, I guess. So we help people buy car insurance that would just last for as long as they need it, really. So it's flexible, allows people to have easier access to vehicles and to car insurance. But I also focus on accessibility, particularly accessibility in mobile. I have written a book, as you mentioned, developing inclusive mobile apps. I have a blog, which is mobileally.com, spelled with A11Y, where I kind of blog about mobile accessibility, and I kind of love to sort of evangelize about mobile accessibility in general. So I like to kind of talk and run workshops, and I have a library for testing for accessibility on iOS. So that's my focus, really.
And I mean, we first met at a conference where you were talking about mobile accessibility. And I guess it's something that sometimes organisations maybe don't focus on as much as maybe they should or could. Why is accessibility so important for you, and why do you like to focus on
it? Accessibility it's kind of so important, really, for all of the software that we build, because it's about how people use our software. It's about that kind of interface between the software itself and people. People are not kind of, nice, easy bits of APIs that you can fit in where you need to. Everything gets a bit messy when you get into meat space. So it's kind of such a wide variety of things, really. You have to make sure, not just that you can use the app and you know how to use the app, but that everyone who potentially wants to use your app is going to be able to use it, and going to be able to use it in a way that's comfortable for them to use. And that means listening to people's preferences, giving people options, not dictating the way that certain things should happen within your app. And so I just kind of find that sort of thing interesting. There's a lot of different technologies that you can use and interface with to enable that. And I just enjoy giving people the tools to make sure that their apps can work for as many people as possible, really.
So I think for me is the percentage of people who actually have some sort of disability that might need a reasonable adjustment in order to have a great experience when using technology. I don't know if you've got any stats from your research about the percentage of people that accessibility issues with mobile apps you might affect, but if you've got any data you could share, I think that would be really interesting to know.
Yeah, so it's around about 20% of people globally who have some form of disability, and that is self-reported. So the stats could be a little bit higher, but around about 20%. That's quite a large number of people. You're talking about hundreds of millions of people who have some kind of disability that will affect them in their daily lives. So if you aren't making your app work for that 20% of people, then that's a big chunk of your market, or your potential market, that you're causing problems for and essentially locking out of your apps.
I mean, that's potentially a fifth of users. I mean, that's huge.
Yeah.
If you think about a fifth of your customer base you're potentially blocking out, there's clearly a business case that companies can be making on accessibility alone. to say that actually, if we make our mobile app accessible or our technology accessible, we can actually make more money as a result of doing this. So why wouldn't companies do it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess as to why they wouldn't do it, the kind of answer to that, I guess, is that it's hard, right? It's not an easy thing to do if you don't do it correctly. Now, if you do bake in accessibility from the start, if you consider it when you're planning features, when you're doing the design, and when you're building it, and you're testing it, if you kind of think about accessibility, each of those steps, you actually probably find it's not that much effort. But if you don't start with an accessibility mindset and you never kind of think about it until maybe you get to the end or you've already shipped the product and go, maybe we should test this for accessibility, that's when things are difficult, because you get this report that kind of tells you all of the things you've done wrong, and they kind of languish in your backlog for a while, and then they're hard to fix. Or sometimes the issues are just kind of a fundamental issue with the way you've designed your feature, and so you kind of would need to go back and rebuild everything.
So I guess accessibility is not always front and center of an organization's mind, and I mean I get that, because you might have reasons why there's multiple different ways to, or multiple different disabilities you got to cater for, multiple different adjustments you might have to make to the app, and actually just by going after one particular aspect of accessibility. So perhaps you go after somebody who is visually impaired to make the app kind of work for them, or somebody who has a hearing impairment to make the app work for them. Just by going after one particular disability or set of characteristics doesn't necessarily automatically open up that 20% of the market. So what other reasons do you think it's good for organizations to really kind of go after and really want to make their app accessible?
Well, I mean, the short answer to that is that it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to make software that people can use and that isn't going to exclude anyone. Nobody wants to exclude people, right? So making your app accessible is just the right thing to do. It's that simple. But as well as the business case of not excluding people, there is of course the legal argument. If you have an app that isn't accessible, there are laws that potentially mean you could find yourself upsetting regulators, or potentially getting sued as a result of that. And the laws obviously vary depending on where you are in the world, but particularly in the US, these laws can be pretty stringent. And it's pretty regular that companies with bad accessibility do get sued as a result of that. So it's a really important thing from a business case. And reputationally, if you get accessibility wrong, that doesn't look good. And if you get it right, you can kind of shout about that. It's something that you can tell people, hey, we care about this kind of stuff.
And I think, in fairness to organisations, nobody would set out to make an app that isn't accessible. And I guess quite often it's simply a matter of ignorance, where people haven't actually realised, because maybe they don't have an issue themselves, or don't need to use a particular piece of functionality, simply aren't aware. So maybe a product manager who hasn't come across what it's like to use the app, or the piece of technology with a particular adjustment having been made. I know in a previous organisation I worked for, we actually brought the RNIB in, and we worked with them to actually give an experience to all of our users, all of our developers and engineers within the organisation, to let them see what it was like to use our app using an adjusted technology. And the insights we got as a result of that were absolutely huge. I mean, it was literally mind blowing to some people, how inaccessible some of our technology was, and that forced a deliberate change into our engineering teams. Is that something you've seen work in other organisations? Is that something that you think many organisations are doing right now? Is that really part of the conversation?
It can work. I have seen organisations do that kind of thing. It can be somewhat controversial, because you're essentially simulating a disability, and it's obviously never going to be the real thing. But there are, if you try navigating with VoiceOver and with the screen curtain on, so that you don't see anything on the screen, that is quite eye-opening, really, because you're using your app in a completely new way, and if it doesn't work for you, you're really going to find out using that. But yeah, I would say just be careful with that kind of thing. I would get some advice from an organisation like the RNIB. I know they do things like this, but the what you want to get out of a session like that is the sense that, okay, we now understand a little bit more about where our shortcomings are with accessibility and what we can fix, as opposed to the kind of a result that sometimes can happen where people kind of think, wow, it's really bad being disabled, I don't want to have a disability, which is absolutely the wrong kind of result to come out of a session like that.
So from an accessibility standpoint, what do you think are maybe the top three things that companies or engineers get wrong when they're considering how to make their mobile app accessible?
Well, I think the number one thing we touched on already, which is not considering it from the start and throughout. If you think of accessibility when you're first planning the project, think of it when you're designing, think of it when you're coding it, and think of it when you're testing it, and all the points in between, then you're going to spend cumulatively a lot less time on accessibility. It's going to seem simpler. It's going to become second nature. Essentially, you're going to get a much better end result, and you're not going to need to go back and make expensive fixes, post-release or once you've had complaints or whatever. So that's kind of number one. It's going to be much more cost-effective and a better experience doing that. Aside from that, I would say, well, let me say kind of the things that I see kind of most being missed out on, and that is in mobile, that is respecting your users' chosen font sizes. So on iOS, we have something called dynamic type, which allows users to adjust their font sizes. On Android, you can change the font size in the accessibility settings as well, and that is used by a lot of people. Again, you'd be looking at around about 20% of people use that feature. And sometimes they will scale the text up, sometimes they'll scale the text down, but it's about their personal preference, right? It's about how they want to use your app. And a lot of apps just don't respond to that setting. And that really is kind of, people expect that now. That's a feature the same as kind of dark mode or something like that. People expect that from their apps. And if you don't respect that, then they'll kind of think, well, the people who made this app weren't really caring about me as a user. So it's that's a super important feature that any app really should be respecting. And then I guess the next thing would be about testing. Testing the app regularly and testing it as part of the development flow. So again, engineers, when they're coding, they really should be doing some accessibility testing, even just basic testing, just to check their work, exactly the same as they would be for writing unit tests or something like that. It's how you know that you've sort of finished what you're doing, essentially. And if you're doing that regularly, it's going to be it's going to become second nature. It's going to become a much simpler part of the development process, and means that you're going to end up with less accessibility issues going into production, and you're going to end up with less effort put in by quality engineers who are kind of doing the full testing, and allowing them to go into more detail for some less common accessibility issues.
So from a web perspective, we have a number of tools that sit within our CI/CD pipelines to do some automated accessibility checking. So I think we use a tool called Pally that you may have come across before, and I've also used a tool called Axt. From a mobile perspective, is there similar automated tools available, and are they any good?
So automated tools for accessibility testing should be used wisely. They will only ever detect a subset of issues, and they can never understand developer intention. As we kind of talked about at the start, accessibility is about kind of that interface between your app and the people who are using it. And so the automated tools can never really kind of get that quite right because they're automated, they're robots, they're not human. So there's only certain things they can pick up on. They're never going to understand the developer intent. So you have to kind of bear that in mind when you're using automated testing for accessibility. But that said, if you use them wisely, they can be an excellent way of saving time and money and guarding against regressions. Because you know if something flags up in there, you know straight away you've got an issue rather than having to wait for it to be tested by quality assurance or getting user testing or anything like that. So it does help, but you have to kind of understand its limitations, and you know you have to understand that it's still super important that you must do manual testing and you must get advice from users through user testing as well. But yeah, for mobile, apps, as you mentioned, although they are predominantly web, they do have tools for iOS and Android as well. Espresso, which is kind of Android's sort of first-party UI testing framework, has some tests for Android for accessibility, and it's already built in. You just have to enable them. Google has a couple of libraries that you can build into Earl Grey for iOS. I have a library as well which you can use with XUI tests if you use Apple's first-party UI testing framework. That library is called Ally UI tests, so A11Y UI tests, and that just builds into XUI, so you can build it into your existing tests. So yeah, there's definitely options available. You just need to use them smartly.
And I guess it's something that if engineers are considering accessibility throughout that development process, you should be writing unit tests and kind of looking at how you can test for accessibility as you'd be testing any other feature within your app, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So thinking if you're an engineer kind of coming along, from a starting point, maybe you haven't really thought about accessibility, maybe it hasn't kind of been something that's really crossed your radar. The learning curve is huge, right, in terms of what you could do and what you should be doing. Where would you get started? What resources would you point people to say, hey, this is how I get started with mobile accessibility?
Yeah, I think this is sometimes why developers don't cover accessibility quite as much as they perhaps should. Is, as you say, it's quite a large topic, and I think some developers don't really know where to start because it kind of can seem a little bit overwhelming at first. The best thing to do is to start, really, to do something, and the more that you do, the more confident you'll feel in using the APIs and understanding what they do and where to use them. The best thing to do is to do some very basic voiceover testing or talkback testing. You can, they both work in basically the same way. You can swipe right or left to go to the previous or next item. You can then double tap to activate an item. Both platforms have shortcuts to enable and disable voiceover, which I would highly recommend enabling those, because if you do that, you've just got this hardware shortcut, and you enable voiceover, test it, and then use the hardware shortcut again to turn it off. And if you ever get stuck, if you're ever not sure what you're doing, if you ever don't know what the gesture is, you just use that shortcut, and it will turn voiceover or talkback off for you. In terms of coding, the best thing to learn about is kind of the real basics, which is in accessibility kind of terms, we call it name, role, value. They're slightly different on both platforms, but for iOS, that would be the accessibility label, and the accessibility value and traits. And if you use those correctly, then everything should be functional. On Android, you can't set the role separately, unfortunately. You just have to make sure you're using the right subclass. So you're using a button if it's a button, using a text field if it's a text field. Don't try and make your own kind of fancy controls from a view. Use the Android kind of standard button and build on top of that if you need something a bit more. And the the text label as well. Make sure you've got some kind of text value on every view that needs to be accessible. So if it's an image button, for example, if you've got an image, make sure that's got a description. So those are kind of the basic things to start with. If you get those right, you should have an app that is at least functionally accessible, even if it's not the best quality, and you can build on that from there. In terms of resources, I would be remiss if I didn't suggest my book, Developing Inclusive Mobile Apps, but you can also, the Apple Human Interface Guidelines, or the HIG as it's commonly called, has a lot of information on there. You can check out my blog, mobileally.com, and that covers both iOS and Android, although to be fair, mostly iOS. And that will give you a bunch of information on where to get started and some extra things that you can build on to go a little bit further as well.
And I guess accessibility is something which is never done right. I mean, you can always improve and do things better. How do you think, from Apple and Google's standpoint, how have they done at really tackling the accessibility issue and really embracing that within their platforms?
And they've done pretty well, actually. Apple specifically have done some really fantastic innovation in that area. Google have done some pretty good work as well. There's certain things that their assistive technology does do better than on iOS, but in general, Apple have got that little bit extra polish and have gone those few steps further. But yeah, with Google, you have a built-in screen reader, you have built-in voice control, you have automatic captions built in. So there's a whole kind of suite of assistive technologies built into Android. And one of the really nice things that Android do is they make the accessibility tree. So the accessibility tree is kind of the data representation of your view that assistive technology uses. They make that available for third parties as well. So you can have non-Google screen readers and assistive technologies if you need it, that might have different features, or you have different kind of ways of interacting with the device, depending on everyone's needs. So that's a really nice feature. With iOS, the built-in screen reader with that voiceover, it's the only option on iOS, but it is really full-featured. There's a lot of things that people can tweak with it. You've also got Braille keyboard support and switch control, voice control, all that kind of stuff. And they really have done quite a lot of innovation for things like last year. They released a new feature for the Apple Watch, which allows you to control the watch using hand gestures of the hand that's wearing the watch. So you just, by kind of moving your fingers, it's able to detect that movement.
I mean, that's phenomenal. I mean, it kind of plays to the fact that some of this technology is just cool, right? You know, there are so many things out there where people are really innovating in the space and thinking, how can we make improvements and how can we make things better? What would you say is, you know, maybe one of the most ingenious things you've seen from an accessibility standpoint within a device?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the controlling your watch using finger gestures is really fantastic. I definitely recommend watching the video for that on Apple's website. There is also some really nice new features coming later this year. As we record, yesterday was Global Accessibility Awareness Day, which is a kind of a big day in the kind of accessibility calendar. And Apple, for the last couple of years, have announced their upcoming accessibility features on that day. And so yesterday they announced some new features, including things like door detection. And so this is something that people who are blind or low vision can use the camera on their device. And that will it will read text, so they can kind of tell where they are, because it will read text off buildings, and it will also direct them towards then the entrance. So super innovative feature, one that you could potentially suggest might be suggesting there may be some kind of AR technology coming up in future, but even just using it on the phone is just going to be really useful. And that's on top of features that are already in iOS that use things like LiDAR and the camera So it does people recognition, and it will, if you're in a queue, it will tell you how far the next person is in front, so you know if you can move forwards in the queue, things like that.
And I guess from an Apple point of view, I mean, the point that Apple released SwiftUI really was a bit of a game changer from an accessibility point of view, because they really kind of thought about what needed to be forced from an accessibility point of view, and how they could make the life of a developer much easier if you're adopting the SwiftUI framework.
Yeah, so this is why for my money, Apple really have that accessibility mindset far more than anyone else. Whereas both platforms, Apple and Google, have both got new declarative UI frameworks. So for Android, we've got Jetpack, and then on iOS, we've got SwiftUI. For iOS, Apple kind of took the opportunity of creating SwiftUI to rethink how accessibility worked with that framework. Whereas in Jetpack, they didn't think about accessibility at all and ended up with a worse experience for accessibility. I understand they are now improving that, but it's, as we kind of talked about before, you're going to get a much better experience thinking about it from the start. But Apple really did that with SwiftUI, and it's a declarative framework, and one of the things that means is it doesn't matter, because we're saying what we want to happen rather than how we want it to happen. It means that the interface doesn't have to be visual. You can take all of that same interface data and turn it into a representation for assistive technology. So it means it's cut out a whole class of bugs, of accessibility bugs, just by using SwiftUI. But then a bunch of the extra features are really simple as well. So probably my favorite feature of SwiftUI is being able to combine views. So there's a technique called semantic views that you can use for accessibility. And this is if you have multiple elements on a screen where they are kind of sort of mean the same thing. So if you've got a few text labels, say in a table row that's kind of data about an object, if you group that together, it makes more sense as one object than it does as individual objects when you're presenting it to VoiceOver or Switch Control or TalkBack or whatever assistive technology. And to do that in UIKit, you had to make a bunch of changes. So you had to say exactly what you didn't want to be accessible, exactly what you now do want to be accessible. You have to add all of the data into your new accessible view. Whereas in SwiftUI, you use a one-line modifier and it does all of that for you. And so it makes accessibility just that extra bit simpler. If we can make it easier for developers, then there's more chance that we're going to get developers excited about it and using it as part of their regular development flow.
So one of the things that I would observe is, on the Engineering Leader, we get a lot of people in leadership positions who are listening to the podcast and who are probably now thinking about, we've got lots of technology out there in production. We might have lots of mobile apps that are doing things. How are we doing, right? How accessible are we? And especially people who are coming from non-technical positions who maybe haven't had your direct control over the development itself or don't understand technically how an app is built. You might be thinking about, well, how do we audit our accessibility? How do we get a handle on how well we're doing? If you were looking at this from that lens, what approach would you take?
So accessibility audits have their place, but it's another kind of area of accessibility that you just have to be a little bit wary. So with accessibility audits, you can kind of, once you've created software or if you've got legacy software, you can get an accessibility professional in to come and do you an audit, and they will do your report and say, okay, I've looked over all of your features and using assistive technology, and this is wrong and this is wrong and this is wrong, and we need to make these improvements. Those reports always seem really negative, right? Because it's just a list of things that you've done wrong. So no one ever feels good once they get a report like that. And from my experience, the results that come out of that often tend to languish in backlogs for a while. And because you've already built the feature, there's not necessarily a ton of impetus to actually make those changes, and it can be quite difficult to make those changes. So yes, you can do it if you've got legacy software, if you've got software that you've already created, and you've not really considered accessibility so far in that, but you want to start thinking about it. This is probably the place to start, right? Get an accessibility audit, because you need a baseline. So you need to know where you are before you can improve. So that's when you should go for an accessibility audit. So if you've got your listeners who are kind of thinking, yes, I want to get started, get an accessibility audit, and then you know where you are, you know your current state. But it's not something that's sustainable going forwards. Going forwards, you really need to build in that kind of inbuilt accessibility at every stage. So you need to get everybody on board with the idea that if we think about accessibility from the start and throughout the process, it's just going to make it easier for everyone, and it's going to give us a much better experience. And this is the point where you need to be getting people, get people to have buy-in on the idea of accessibility. So give them the tools to understand it, understand how to build accessibly, why it's important, what it means for users by doing this or by not doing this, what it means for your business, and it's an accessibility audit can be helpful to start with, but it's not sustainable for ongoing development. With that, you want to get accessibility advice upfront and throughout the process.
I think something that I found effective within the organisations and teams that I've managed is actually making accessibility someone's, giving it somebody to champion. So not necessarily someone's responsibility, it should obviously be everybody's responsibility within the team, but actually making sure that somebody is on the hook to actually, to really care about it. Maybe somebody who is particularly passionate about accessibility or, is really keen on the subject, to make sure that somebody is always in the conversations evangelising about, well, have we thought about this? Have we thought about that? Keeping up with the latest trends, you're reading books and you're reading blogs and kind of finding out about what we should be doing in the space. It can't be an afterthought. It's got to be something which is very deliberately considered throughout the development process.
Yeah, absolutely. An accessibility champions network or something along those lines can be really valuable, because there are going to be people in your organization already. You might not know it, but there are going to be people in your organization who are passionate about accessibility. Maybe just because it's something that they use, perhaps, or that they just kind of realize that this is an important thing that we should be doing for our customers. Tap into that. Get them on board, and they can then help enthuse other people and evangelize to the rest of their team, and they can be the person that stand up sees going, okay, but have we tested this with accessibility?
And I guess it also doesn't necessarily have to be a technical person either. I mean, I think that it's a case of having the voice there, someone who's actually interested. It doesn't make a difference who in the organisation it is, as long as you're going to be in the right conversations in order to make sure it has been considered, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, really, when you're talking about software development, really everybody involved in that process, not necessarily just technical people, everybody involved in the process can have a beneficial effect and can get involved with it. And it's just about having that mindset and kind of encouraging others, really.
And of course, I mean, you can hear your passion for accessibility, with everything we've talked about today. And I guess that passion led you to actually to write a book. So, I mean, what actually inspired you to do that?
The book kind of felt like a bit of a challenge, really. So I did find that people were starting to come to me specifically with accessibility questions. I kind of de facto became someone who was known for knowing how accessibility works on iOS. So I kind of felt that if people are asking me these questions, I have something to share, something that is valuable to people. So I thought I should start writing some of that down. The actual impetus to do a book, I guess, is quite personal. I am dyslexic, and you know, people with dyslexia aren't really supposed to write books, right? So I kind of thought I'm gonna give that a go, and you know, challenge myself, and you know, do something that I'm not supposed to do. See if I can do that. And it was a lot of work, but I think it came off okay, and it certainly helped that it's something that I was enthusiastic about, as you say.
I mean, that's fantastic. I mean, the idea of writing a book, I think a lot of people kind of look and go, that's a huge challenge, right? I mean, it's a huge undertaking. I mean, how would you even approach starting to think about how to get a book deal?
So for me, I wrote a proposal. I wrote down kind of a plan for what I was intending to do with the book, what I wanted to cover, why it was important, and kind of the rough outline of the book. Um, with the eye that if it didn't work out, then at least they would make good blog posts, if nothing else. And then I sent that off to various technical publishers to see if anybody was interested in that way. The technical publishers always have people that you can contact with proposals. And yeah, Apress were kind enough to accept my proposal. I understand that they'd actually been looking for a mobile accessibility book anyway, so it seems as though it was good timing. But yeah, they were kind enough to accept my proposal.
And I guess so much of that as well is about actually wanting to share knowledge and kind of help other people to get up to speed or to develop their skills in some way. And I mean, something that I observe about the mobile development community, I mean, this is true of all developer communities, but I think actually, particularly mobile, and actually particularly the Apple developer ecosystem, is the willingness with which people are prepared to share good practice, share advice, and put time in to help each other to improve. And I know you do a lot of that. I mean, you spend a lot of time talking at conferences, running workshops. Is that how you learn best personally?
It's certainly something that helps me learn. I find that writing is probably the thing that mostly cements things in my head. I read a lot of blog posts about accessibility, and I watch a lot of people's talks. You know, if you've ever written or done a talk on mobile accessibility, I've probably consumed that at some point. But that kind of helps me pick things up. But then what really cements things in my mind and helps me understand, you know, in kind of that full detail of how and when and where to use techniques, I find that writing is kind of the best way to do that. But then presentations I really enjoy because that kind of helps me, I guess, because I'm talking out loud when I'm planning it. It kind of helps me cement my arguments, I think, a little bit more, because as I'm saying what's in my head, it kind of helps me think. I'm not quite sure that made a full sense, the sense that I'm intending it to make, or I'm not quite sure that argument was quite strong enough. So that definitely helps doing it that way, I think.
And in talking of conferences and workshops, do you have any conferences and events coming up? I know obviously now we're getting back to in-person events after pandemic. It's really good to connect with people again and actually get together in person.
Well, yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, yesterday was Global Accessibility Awareness Day. I did three events yesterday, so I haven't planned much else because three in a day seemed like quite a lot to be doing anyway. But I do have a workshop coming up at the iOS Dev UK conference in Aberystwyth in September, which is always probably my favourite iOS conference. It's certainly not glamorous, but it has a great community feel to it, so I always really enjoy it. But yeah, I'm running a workshop there, which is about what it's called identifying and fixing iOS accessibility issues. So the way this workshop works is, well, it's the best kind of workshop really from a facilitator's point of view, that the attendees do all of the work. I give you an app, and the app has a whole bunch of accessibility failures, and then between us we're going to work together to find out what the accessibility failures are. So I'm going to give you some tools to find accessibility failures as quickly and kind of simply as possible. So we're going to find those, and then we're going to, once we identify them, we're going to work to fix them.
And if listeners haven't come across iOS Dev UK before, I mean, it really is, personally, I think one of the best conferences that I've ever been to. I mean, it is as you said, Rob, it's definitely not glamorous. It's at the University of Aberystwyth. This year will mark their 10th anniversary, having missed a couple of years because of COVID. But it's got such a great community feel, and I think that there are a bunch of people now, myself included, who have been there for several years, and there is such a good community. So if you do get the opportunity, I would massively encourage anyone to come along to that. It's a really great event. And of course, not the only great event that's coming up. We are now literally days away from this year's WWDC. What are you hoping to see this year, Rob?
I mean, this is kind of probably the answer that most people are going to give, I would imagine, right? But it's got to be glasses. And I know everybody's been saying that for years, but it feels like we're slightly closer this year than we've been for the last sort of 5 years. And the idea of AR glasses to me is just kind of mind-blowing. I think we need to kind of figure something out with the creepiness, and I kind of feel like Apple would probably actually do pretty well at the whole creepiness angle. But in terms of accessibility, AR glasses really fascinate me because it's a whole new way of interacting with technology and interacting with the world at the same time. AR and VR for accessibility is pretty new, and so there's some interesting research happening in those areas, but not quite enough yet. But AR in particularly, because it's just not something that the technology is really quite there for yet. There's very little on that at all. And I know Apple are doing a lot of work in terms of AR accessibility, and I really hope that they will share that publicly when it gets to be time. But the idea of, as we mentioned earlier, about the door detection for people with no or low vision, there's hundreds of things that you can do like that, but also for people who are perhaps anxious, or people who have something like autism perhaps, being able to indicate certain things to them on a heads-up display if they're navigating, being able to give them certain bits of information when they need it, directions, things like that can be really helpful as well. But there's also, I guess, the opposite of that, particularly with someone who is anxious. Having too much information could also, result in the opposite and could be, more anxiety-inducing. So this is why we need the research, really. And as I say, I know Apple are doing some of that research, and I'm excited to see what they've found out.
So, I mean, like I think Apple are ready now. We're ripe to have a new product, a new game-changing product in the market. And I don't think Apple have really had that for several years. I mean, obviously we had the Apple Watch before that, the iPad and the iPhone. I think we are really ready to see something new. I am a little bit wary about the idea of Apple glasses, and the reason I'm wary of it is because I was one of those poor, unfortunate individuals that went out and bought Google Glass when Google Glass became available a few years ago. And I spent a lot of money on Google Glass, and then Google decided to discontinue the Glass Explorer program in the UK, and I ended up with a very expensive pair of glasses that didn't look particularly stylish or cool, and maybe were actually a little bit creepy. So I'm a little bit wary. I don't want to end up in that same position again, but it would definitely be cool for Apple to come out with a new product. Whether we see it at WWDC or whether it ends up maybe later in the year at a September event, who knows? But it will definitely be cool if Apple do something fun like that, I guess, which would be really great to see. From your point of view, Rob, I mean, obviously great talking to you today. If listeners to the podcast have maybe picked up on some of the things you've been talking about, maybe they're interested in talking to you more about some of the ideas you've shared, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Yeah, it's been great to talk to you as well, Steve. So I'm usually active on Twitter, so that's probably the easiest way to get in touch. I am Rob, RWAPP. On Twitter, you can find me there. You can also drop me an email if you'd like to, if you want to share anything in terms of mobile accessibility. I'd love to hear from you. The best email address to get me on that probably is ally, so A11Y at mobileally.com. I'd be really interested to hear from you. But yeah, you can also check out my blog, which is mobileally.com, and buy my book, I guess.
And if people want to buy your book, where can they get it from?
Yeah, it's called Developing Inclusive Mobile Apps. You can buy it from Amazon, or you can buy it directly from Apress as well.
Brilliant. Well, Rob, it's been really insightful talking to you today. Thank you so much for sharing all of your experience and all of your skills. It's been really great to hear, and I'm sure we'll get you back onto the Engineering Leader at some point in the future. Thank you so much for joining the Engineering Leader today.